approached me to do this, he suggested a division of labour might be that I deal with the period since Barcelona and what in the title is termed the setting of parameters for the EU's relationship with Algeria today, and that gradually we would move up to the current day as the panel progressed. And of course, in my current role, I'm dealing very much with contemporary issues, and of course this threw me back straight away 10 years ago when I suddenly remembered I had indeed written a piece, and Barbara is here, Barbara Allen-Roberson put together a joint book in which I wrote a chapter entitled Algeria, France's Disarray and Europe's Conundrum. And it was basically addressing the issue of why and for what reasons Europeans, particularly being so close to the conflict going on in Algeria in the 1990s, were unable to intervene or chose not to intervene or didn't find the possibility of engaging in ways that reduce the violence. And the first thing I would say, of course, is rather than start this overview from Barcelona, the significant, if you like, context for this decade, of course, is what's now referred to as La Décennie Noire, the Black Decade, in which so many people died, in which violence reigned. And it's not easy to, and certainly not easy for Algerians to forget, but given that things have moved on and we're now in a new decade, it's fading, if you like, into the past. But I think it's true to say that the defining factor in EU-Algerian relations during this decade was, in fact, the nature of the violence, the fact that many Europeans couldn't find an entry point for dealing with it. The Algerian authorities, the government was keen that this was to say to the world that this was an intra-Algerian conflict and not susceptible to outside intervention. And I'm afraid, given the discussion we've had already about the chasse gardée, certainly at the European Union level, it's very clear that where the French took the lead, other European states would follow. Where the French chose not to take the lead or were dissuasive of EU intervention in Algeria, others stepped back. And it's only at the end of the decade that we saw more forthright policy, if you like, from other actors. But certainly, at the beginning of the decade, there was confusion over interpreting the violence. There was obviously ambivalence, as we know, of the whole phenomenon of Islamism across the region. There was a fear that it would spread, and of course then from 1992, when the conflict became violent, there was a fear of jihadism and Islamist underground movements spreading across the region. So it should be said that certainly in 1992, prior to Barcelona, the main concern of the European Union and its member states was to stop the spread of that violence and engage in conflict control, if you like. And in that respect, they deferred to the Algerian ability to contain that conflict within Algeria's borders. So if we're going to look at Barcelona, in many ways, this process was superimposed on this pre-existing relationship, where contacts between the EU and Algeria developed in subsequent years. It was limited mostly to economics, as we know. In many ways, sadly, the conflict was concentrated in the populated area of northern Algeria in ways that didn't directly affect the hydrocarbon sector. So contracts were concluded within this. BP was particularly prominent, but other actors were able to carry on, if you like, doing business in the hydrocarbon sector with Algeria. But not being able to engage, certainly after foreigners were attacked and many people closed down or restricted their diplomatic representation in Algiers. It was very difficult to promote the kind of business and indeed make progress on the association agreement with Algeria in the immediate aftermath of Barcelona. And of course, Barcelona, in its inception, was very much a regional conception. It was a way of saying the European Union wants to engage not just bilaterally and reinforce bilateral links, which they do through the association agreements and more recently the European neighbourhood policy, but actually to create a free trade zone and cooperation within the Mediterranean basin. And paradoxically, this was inspired by the progress that seemed to be being made at the time between Israel and the Palestinians under the Oslo process. It was that sense that somehow we could engage both Israelis and their Arab neighbours in a free trade zone that actually kick-started Barcelona. But sadly for Algeria, Algeria at the time was in a completely different dynamic, and I think this has led to a lot of the language of l'exception algérienne. Algeria from the beginning of Barcelona, because of its domestic conflict, was always treated differently, and I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that this situation affected very much the conclusion of the association agreement with the EU until 2002, and it was actually put in operation in 2005. Whereas in the case of Morocco and Tunisia, these association accords have included a full decade ahead of Algeria. So in many ways we're playing catch-up between the EU and Algeria.